Warning, what you're about to hear was recorded several weeks ago. In those ensuing weeks, I've had a lot more time to mull over how I feel about Netflix's Iron Fist, and sadly, I think that this review is not necessarily reflective of my current opinions. I'm putting it up anyway in the hopes that it'll entertain somebody, but seriously, I think that I was being a bit too kind to this show here. It's real bad. And not a lot of the bones that I throw at it in this video are still holding up for me, unfortunately. Anyway, with that out of the way, enjoy the show. Marvel, Netflix, Iron Fist. Let's review. If you're not scratching your head harder than a louse-ridden baboon at the title of this video, then odds are you already know about the critical reception of Marvel Netflix's Iron Fist, the latest in the build to the four-way crossover that is The Defenders. I've come to a lot of conclusions about Marvel Netflix since reviewing Daredevil Season 2 exactly 1 year ago at the time of this writing, the most important of which is that on the whole I actually prefer the Marvel Studios movies to the long-form Netflix series. I still love most of what these shows have to offer, don't get me wrong, but people who claim the Netflix output to be better than the theatrical stuff on the whole by sheer virtue of it being darker and more grounded and more methodically paced could never really get me on their side. I think I was in the minority for having that opinion, but Iron Fist is a pretty big dent in the overall reception of the Defenders bunch. How big? Well, calling it lukewarm would be to put it in the nicest possible terms. Of all the people I've had actual conversations with, I seem to have liked it the most, and even I can't confidently call it good television. If it weren't for the flash of the logo every episode, you'd mistake it for a DC property. It's a level of television mediocrity that's only notable because it takes place in the heretofore invincible-seeming MCU. But, as with most things, there are positives to be found, so indulge me as I pick apart what about this series stuck with me, having managed to remain largely enthused and hopeful as I was sitting down with it, and open to being the one guy who didn't agree with critical consensus. The show gets off to a pretty weak start immediately, with the most generic and understated opening sequence of the Netflix lot. Honestly, I could make a whole video just pointing out what's wrong with this thing. The one cool idea it has is the visual of wavy, ink-like trails following the limbs of Danny Rand as he fights invisible enemies, along with what looks like a film grain effect reminiscent of a 70s kung fu flick, but that's barely noticeable and might even just be my eye playing tricks on me. But these moves are repetitive, with Danny delivering the exact same sweeping, slow-motion kick to the screen 5 times, and the opening really doesn't have anything else going on. Then there's the music, which really tells you nothing about the show that you're watching. It's essentially nothing for over a minute. I mean, okay, look at the opening to Daredevil. Blood slowly dripping over an invisible city to reveal our setting, emphasis placed on the scales of justice and the cross of a church, seeding the major motifs of religion and law throughout the series, and a final striking image of our protagonist, the devil himself, all set to a memorable, haunting melody. Jessica Jones is a heavy, striking purple, visualizing a busy apartment complex as if with watercolors, with a moody instrumentation that, like the show itself, takes cues from hard-boiled PI flicks, before building to a killer guitar solo. Luke Cage isn't a great opening, but it's got a funky blaxploitation-style riff going and a slow build of as Luke's fists take a full minute to make a smashing impact on whatever it is he's tearing up. It gives you an impression of the show's tone and Luke's own strength, with the street signs highlighting how important the setting of Harlem will be to the show. Patient. Iron Fist is a blank, dark bleh visually, set to music that sounds like a temp track. Heck, Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. has a far superior musical theme, and it doesn't even have an opening sequence. It doesn't even follow the signature color trend that's been set up through the show posters, lighting, promo photos, and previous openings. Red, purple, yellow, green. Red, purple, yellow, green. Red, purple, yellow, dark blue bordering on black. It's especially bad because the show itself makes frequent use of green shading. Having already tempered my expectations due to poor reviews, this was a bad note for the show to open on, and I ended up skipping it in every episode past the second one. Keeping on the subject of the relatively superficial whiz-bang stuff, the action also doesn't get off to a great start. The fight choreography is weak and not aided whatsoever by tons of slow-mo and unnecessary cuts away from fighters to focus on weapons. Thankfully, this is chiefly true of the first third of the series. That is to say, the action improves quite a bit from downright terrible, but never becomes spectacular or even all that impressive. It goes from distractingly poor and sparse to pretty fun in the moment, but it's still a massive letdown that the only show of these four with the real impressive choreography is Daredevil. Jessica Jones and Luke Cage at least have an excuse. Jessica has no formal training, and Luke would absolutely eviscerate anyone if he combined his massive strength with any fancy moves. Danny Rand, Iron Fist or no Iron Fist, should be well past the point that mob goons, trainees, and middle-aged men pose any kind of threat. And yet, to keep the tension up, will constantly put him in the underdog position. It's a step up, but it's a step up to something okay rather than very good. And that's the show in a nutshell, really, because of the general answer to how much does Iron Fist suck is unfortunately enough to keep it from being a very good show overall. Most of my problems are to varying degrees, somewhat alleviated by the 6-episode mark, but they are still problems and they are noticeable. So we might as well tackle them before they start to improve. The casting of Finn Jones as Danny Rand was predictably controversial for those who think that a martial arts series was the perfect opportunity to introduce the first real Asian superhero into our current landscape. And while I certainly think that Asians get an even shorter end of the stick in pop culture than other minorities, I also think that unless context demands it, you should disregard race and cast whoever is best for the role. That said, there's probably a million people who would have been better than Finn Jones. I don't want to be too mean to the guy, maybe it's just the material letting him down, but his performance is really generic. He slowly improves as the series goes on, but there's no reason you had to cast this guy over any Asian who might have wanted the part. And yeah, the fact that Danny is a literal white savior figure spouting fortune cookie sayings who's constantly using his martial arts prowess to either beat up or condescend to Asian characters is present. I can't help it, you guys. I know there's this instinctual drive to try and fight the inescapable grip politics has on our fiction, but there's some kind of uncomfortable race-related tropes regularly popping up in this thing, and it's distracting. We literally stop the plot in one episode just so we can indulge in a drunken master-style fight because we've got to check that box, yeah? Not gonna lie though, this guy's pretty fun. Back on the subject of Finn Jones, his problem isn't so much that he doesn't have a range, but that he doesn't do any parts of that range particularly well. He's honestly the first example I can think of the MCU completely miscasting one of their costumed heroes. Again, the writing for Danny Rand's character might just be part of the problem. The Marvel Cinematic Universe up till now has never had a problem creating compelling protagonists, and even though Matt Murdock, Jessica Jones, and Luke Cage haven't proven as accessible as the characters you see in the movies, they're all, I think, sympathetic and fascinating in their own ways. At the top of the series, Danny Rand is just kind of a pretentious douchebag who starts fights over the pettiest things and can't seem to listen to simple instructions, or even explain himself to anyone for more than 5 seconds without seeming like a complete nut job. For most of the series, he's an absolute child, and though other characters will call him out on being childish, he doesn't really have an arc where he grows out of it. You'd think that someone who'd spent a decade and a half having Eastern philosophy drilled into him would have dealt with his childhood trauma enough that he isn't having vivid flashbacks every 10 minutes, bordering on panic attacks, but for some reason, any time Danny spent at Kunlun doesn't seem to have done him an ounce of good. His relationship with almost every other character is chock full of immaturity that only serves to make him look like kind of a creep. Like, buys up the building a woman lives and works in so that he can press her for favors kinda creep. That said, he and Colleen Wing do develop a chemistry eventually, and perhaps the biggest feat that the series pulls off is making me buy that the two of them eventually get involved together, even if that still is contributing a bit to the uncomfortable politics. Unfortunately, for the first several episodes, I'm left with far too many instances of literally shouting at the screen over how insufferable Danny is, and he honestly doesn't improve much at the 6-episode mark. He stops being super annoying, but never stops being super crazy and hard to relate to. The character does have flaws that are addressed and dealt with, namely obsession and rage issues, and the fact that he's actually mentally unhinged. But all in all, his characterization seems to jump all over the place from unreasonable and belligerent to mellow and sweet. Even when he's being likable, it feels like we haven't properly tackled the real screwed up parts of his personality the way we should have, and he's ultimately the least compelling character in his own show. The most compelling is probably Ward Meacham, played by Tom Pelphrey. Pelphrey himself is just a way stronger actor than Jones once you realize what he's doing with the performance. There are a lot of dramatic moments that are undermined a bit by his over-the-top facial expression, but for the most part, both he and the writing sell Ward as a fascinating, tragic foil to Danny. And one of the best things about the show is how wonderfully complex the relationship between the two of them eventually becomes. His sister Joy is likable and interesting enough, and the series also pulls her into a lot of unexpected directions, even if where we ultimately leave her makes no sense to me. You might not expect in the first episode just how sympathetic they're both going to end up being. The real villains of the show include Madame Gao, making her first appearance in Season 1 of Daredevil, and some others who I won't go into for spoiler reasons. Gao has a real good mix of intimidating and charming, even though I haven't got any more evidence for my Gao is totally an alien theory, and that's disappointing. Outside of her, though, the villain presence is kinda weak. And I'm one of the people who habitually defends Marvel's quote-unquote villain problem, so you know that's a big deal coming from me. We've got two other villains, one of which is really generic and unmemorable and played by the only actor in the show worse than Jones, and the other doesn't actually spend all that much time being an antagonist. There's also Colleen Wing, played by Jessica Henwick, and she's alright. She has the potential to be this really cool supporting character like Misty Knight was on Luke Cage, the type who could totally carry her own show. Unfortunately, once she and Danny get romantically entangled, she quickly becomes a satellite love interest. The show quickly puts her in a box performance-wise, as everything she says or does or feels revolves around him, and it leaves her feeling not very interesting in her own right once all is said and done. Be prepared for a lot of samey conversations, body language, and facial expressions once the two of them get together. Rosario Dawson is always perfect as Claire Temple, and I like that this show is furthering her arc of slowly becoming more and more proactive over the course of these many shows. It's no surprise that her first episode is when things actually start to pick up. Seriously, I love what this franchise has been doing with her. Put these 4 series together and what you basically have is Claire Temple's superhero origin running in the background of everyone else's. That said, I think it's a testament to how shoddy the writing is in comparison to the other shows that even with Dawson's spectacular acting, Claire doesn't sound nearly as human here as she usually does. Most of the cast outside of the major players are nameless, impactless bit players, which is partially why this show's setting is basically a blank backdrop, in contrast to how full of character Harlem and Hell's Kitchen feel on their shows. There's no interesting street gangs or beleaguered politicians or cops or everyday colorful citizenry to make Danny Rand's piece of New York feel lived in. I suppose being the uber-gentrified, seemingly unaffected by the Chitauri invasion part of New York lends the setting and identity by contrast, but I doubt anyone's coming out of this series praising how fleshed out the world feels. It wouldn't be so bad that New York feels unremarkable if we'd gotten to see the lush, ethereal land of Kunlun for any extended period of time, but we literally never visit the place once, even in flashback. The first few episodes are full of the laziest tropes and shorthand that are only as bad because they're wholly unnecessary. The series establishes how Danny's kept his iPod full of nostalgic music from his childhood, something that feels really trite after so many other Marvel heroes with a love of nostalgic music as a defining character trait. And he makes friends with a wacky but charming hobo who becomes a kindred spirit. Guess what? Neither of those things are relevant past the first episode. Instead, they're abandoned for a whole gaslighting the hero into thinking maybe their powers aren't real and maybe they aren't who they say they are thing, which is such an unconfident, growing pains era thing for a superhero property to do. Not helping is how contrived it is. As is often the case when we pull this trope, Danny has to act like a complete idiot with no understanding of what will and won't make him sound crazy. I get that having Danny Rand prove he's really Danny Rand sets up all the thematic identity stuff that follows him throughout the series and does actually become an idea with focus around the 6-episode mark, but as a plotline, it's really trite. That combined with the fact that we never see Kunlun and rarely see the Iron Fist used for that matter all make it seem like the show is ashamed of its subject matter. When the series starts to get decent is unsurprisingly when its thematic intent becomes more clear, and the way it talks about identity, sanity, control, destiny, and the like is what really kept me intellectually stimulated, on top of building on the themes of the sanctity of life, which has been an element throughout all these shows, and which I expect to culminate in something big once these 4 heroes who all have their various hang-ups with killing people meet each other in The Defenders. Unfortunately, the show really only pays lip service to these themes, and we don't get a full picture of any of these ideas, at least not from our main character. The entire series asks the question of who is Danny Rand, who is the Iron Fist, and can our protagonist be both of those things? And never really provides an answer. It's disappointing. The show had a chance to make all of its non-action related flaws retroactively fascinating, and it never really goes that route. Not since the first season of Supergirl have I so vehemently disliked the opening episodes of something only for it to actually improve just when I'd come close to totally giving up on it. Unfortunately, Iron Fist doesn't improve nearly as much as Supergirl did, and even at its best is marred by massive problems. In the end, like Luke Cage, JJ, and Daredevil Season 2 before, this is another Marvel Netflix series that could have benefited from being a few episodes shorter on top of everything else. Iron Fist just happened to show the symptoms of this problem earlier rather than later. I know it doesn't sound like it, but I am ultimately glad that I sat down and watched this. I firmly recommend that you give it a shot and decide what does and doesn't work for yourself, but ooh boy, do not raise your expectations very high, and especially be prepared to slog through the first few episodes. The show never comes close to achieving true greatness. Danny is by far the MCU's worst protagonist. Everyone is subject to at least one moment of bad dialogue or seemingly nonsensical characterization choices. The action only ever gets as good as Daredevil, which for a series about a martial artist trained by Master Splinter is always going to be a bit shameful. And like the Marvel Netflix stuff before it peaks well before it ends. I think there's enough potential good in it that you should give it a shot, but it's not like I don't see why it's placed as the first real critical dud to be associated with the MCU. Well, that was a bit of a downer. Hopefully the next video that I do will have me in better spirits. That said, I can leave you with a bit of good news in case you're new to my channel. The first is good news for me and you, which is that you can subscribe by clicking that little subscribe button over there, letting you know whenever I've got something new out, which hopefully shouldn't be too infrequent. The second is that if you're here as an MCU fan, you can check out my most recent video aside from this, which is definitely more positive. It's my worst to best rankings of all the MCU movies, from Iron Man to Civil War to Doctor Strange. So if you're curious, or if you just want to hear me talk about something that I actually enjoy, then click that little link up there in the corner of the video. Make sure to leave a like on that video and this one, and hopefully I will see you for the next one.